So Konstantin Kisin, thank you for coming. You're in Australia at the moment. British satirist, podcaster, guest on GB News, BBC author. What have I missed? Anything else?
No, I have my own YouTube show called Triggernometry.
Triggernometry, the podcast.
But yeah, you got it.
Yeah, you're a busy man. And you're now on a tour in Australia as well, going to Melbourne, Sydney. You come here to Canberra to have a bit of a Q&A in Parliament House.
Yeah.
So it's great to have you.
Great honour for me.
Oh, yeah, it's terrific. And you've just walked in, so thank you for coming on the Based podcast. And I always say to people before we kick off, the Based podcast is only for the very based. And you are truly very based, so we have you on. It's great to have you on.
It is weird, isn't it, that we're in this point, Alex, that saying things that 10, 15 years ago were just normal now makes you very based. Because that is literally all I do.
Yeah.
I just say things that used to be normal 10 years ago, and I'm just, oh my God, wow, this is revolutionary.
It would have been difficult to create an audience 10 years ago saying things like, I just want to be left alone and have a normal life. But that's sort of where we're up to. Now, you're born in the Soviet Union, 1982.
Yes.
And so tell us about that. What was that like growing up? You came to the UK as an 11-year-old, I think.
Somewhere between 11 and 13. Yeah, but yes, I grew up in late Soviet Union and early 90s Russia.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons that I think people with our backgrounds who have seen the alternative system, we are naturally quite wary of potentially our society now going in that direction. So I grew up with stories from my parents and grandparents telling me about being sent to the gulag for saying the wrong thing or expressing the wrong opinion. Yeah. And so all of this was ingrained in me from a historical point of view, but also then my own childhood experience. I mean, I remember this is late Soviet Union. When I would have gone to school would have been 88 or something, 87, something like that, whenever it would have been. And my parents saying to me, the stuff that we're discussing here, you mustn't discuss that at school because we'll be in trouble. And it actually was the case in my family. My grandfather at one point criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in a private conversation. One of the other people there reported him to the authorities, and the result of that was that he lost his job, his wife lost her job, and both their children, my dad and my aunt, were kicked out of university for just saying that in a private conversation. So I am always a little bit wary when we get to a position where people express an opinion that's not particularly popular or not popular with the people in power, and then suddenly they start losing work or opportunities or whatever. That doesn't seem to me like a healthy way, particularly for Western society.
It sounds like COVID you're talking about there.
Among other things.
COVID in Australia. You've been here now, 3 or 4 days?
Yeah.
And what are your impressions of Australia?
I love it. It's really interesting to me. Visually, I feel like Australia looks like America, but with British people who are not quite as miserable. That's sort of the vibe I get. It's like British people if they got enough sun. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Enough vitamin D.
Enough vitamin. That's what I feel. But also, my impression is, and as I speak with people and learn more about the history and kind of the economy here as well, I think you're not quite as far down the crazy path that much of the rest of the Western world is down. So I think you are heading in the same direction, is my sense, but maybe not quite as far down. You've maybe had more of a warning. You were able to learn a little bit from our mistakes, or maybe you're just a couple of years behind. And so it seems to me that you still have a chance. When I meet lots of Aussies over in the UK, you were at ARC.
I was.
And so were lots of other people. And I always feel when I meet Aussies, they're a little bit like those Japanese soldiers stuck in the islands after World War II, still clinging on to the fight.
Vestiges.
But now that I'm here, I sort of understand it, because I think you've got not only the makings, but actually a great society here, and a great country with, economically, I think you're in a much healthier position than most people in the Western world. Your debt to GDP ratio is nowhere near as bad. It's bad, let's be honest, but not as bad as it is in the UK or in the US. Yeah. And there's lots of other reasons that I think if 60% of your economy is people digging stuff out of the ground, there's not a lot of woke people in a mine. Do you know what I mean?
Well, there's not a lot of miners in this building, by the way. This is the part of the problem. As you walk around today, I'm sure you will make that reflection. But the political class has become dominated by a small group, I think, and so that is reflecting back on Australia. But no, you're absolutely right. People who work with their hands, people who do real jobs, not politicians, tend to be more sensible and pragmatic, I think. It's interesting, actually. ARC was the first time I've been to London in 20 years, and you don't get a huge look at it, but I saw snapshots of it, and it didn't look like the London I remember, I have to say. I mean, I was much younger, but it was ultimately something that there are bills, they're not our bills, though. Red are the only ones we worry about. It felt like a very different country. And I mean, you've sort of experienced it since, I suppose, the early 90s or thereabouts. What have you been? What's happened in the UK?
Well, the demographics of London have changed fundamentally. It's mostly an immigrant and I'm a first generation immigrant to the UK myself. Most of the people who live there were not born there at this point. And so it is a city that has changed. It's not, I don't think it's as much of a British city as it was when I first came. Not least because people like me, I think, there's immigration is beneficial to society when it's properly managed and controlled, and you're bringing the right people in who you want to come. But I think we're heading in a direction where, if you look at the numbers, we're having an immigration policy that I'm not sure is beneficial to our society. And London is a little bit just visually. I know what you mean. Like when my family come over from Russia or Ukraine or Armenia, they just visually. They're surprised at how the city is, and it's happened in the last 20 years or so, and it really is it's a different city to what it was.
And do you think it's? I mean, we talked about this a little bit before, but this sort of progress that the left have made. You talked about things that we say now that would have been completely benign 20 years ago, even 10, probably 5 in many respects. This is, in my view, a product of the long march through the institutions. We now have schools in Australia that are teaching kids things we never expected. I had a bill before Parliament yesterday involving a prohibition on childhood gender transitions, and it was, the feathers flew. We're talking about putting a prohibition on children having major interventions, and yet that seems to be almost controversial in places like this. What's happened? I mean, has it happened probably in a similar way in the UK? You think that it has in Australia? I mean,
well, I wouldn't be able to compare to Australia, but I think this is something that we're all importing from the United States. Where, by the way, in the UK, we've made a bit more progress in pushing back against it than I think in America they have done, and that's partly because the profit motive in the United States. There's a lot of money to be made from this, and so people are incentivized to carry on down this path. But actually UK is now being called Turf Island, and that's because we are making progress, admittedly from a very bad place.
And it's sort of coming in, those bells. I just have to check my phone here just to make sure that I will.
Is it a gender transition bill? Because if I'll go with you, I'll vote.
In terms of one of your other pet subjects, I think is tech censorship as well. You've done a bit of work on that. Hugely noticeable during COVID, but also I think for the conservative side of politics, for all of us, we're now finding that it's harder and harder to get our message out. We've spent a lot of time trying to, find people through emails and other ways of communicating. But what are we going to do? I mean, this ultimately feels once again a bit like the sort of things you would have seen out of the Soviet Union in terms of propaganda and keeping the message isolated and centralised. From your point of view, how do you get your message out, and how do you find it with Triggernometry or...
Well, we haven't had too many issues with trigonometry. I must say, during COVID, the crackdowns got serious, and we had to be careful around that. But more broadly, my view is that Elon Musk has single-handedly changed the game, because what he has done is essentially opened up a place where open conversation can happen. And what that means is there's not as much point really censoring anything else, because if you're Facebook, let's say, okay, well, you're going to shut people down. They're just going to go to Twitter, and you're just losing those clicks, you're losing that audience. And likewise, you just look like a censorious tyrant if that's what you're doing. So Elon Musk, I think, has single-handedly changed the game on that.
But it's a problem when you're sort of reliant on the goodwill of a particular... I mean, this used to happen, or we would have laws, we still do have laws in this country about media ownership and not having the controlled so much in a certain number of hands. But now we've got this kind of global approach to social media and news media. It's very hard to know how it gets tackled properly. I mean, I think we're probably all in the same boat, not wanting too much government regulation, but it feels like we need a bit here to make sure that they don't do what they did during COVID and just switch off stuff that was true, and that includes government interfering with it as well. We've had the Twitter files story, and we had a similar thing here where we discovered in this very office, we discovered that our Department of Home Affairs were dealing with 2 different companies to shut down the posts of Australians. So it's a space that I don't think has properly been addressed yet. I'm just interested in your, as somebody that would be speaking some truth on social media, you would see that firsthand, I think. Are you experiencing more of it through Facebook and others and YouTube than...
Well, to be honest with you, it really hasn't been that much of an issue for us recently. So it's not something I'm too worried about. And as I say, I think Elon Musk actually has big plans for Twitter beyond just let's open up the Overton window. He's trying to make it a video platform. It's very hard, by the way. So it's not ready.
Yeah.
Like we are not publishing our content on there because the platform isn't designed for video and it's not very calibrated to that.
Yeah.
But the fact that you can communicate openly there, I think forces all the other tech platforms to also be much more careful. Yeah. And as for government regulation, I think people like us who don't want the government to be too involved, we ought to be very wary, actually, of forging weapons that will be used against us. Because you can have government come in and say, no, you've got to do this. But then when the other part is in power, they will use the same tools to shut down or to cause things to happen.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, we are in the process of bringing what they're calling combating misinformation laws into Australian Parliament, which are in my view, a Trojan horse way of trying to look like they're keeping the debate sensible, but in actual fact, what it really would do is allow the government's message to be the only message, and that's very, very dangerous as well. So I totally agree with you on that, and I think you're right. I know you're sick of this subject. I've heard you say it several times. Wokeness. Where did it come from? And it's inveigled Australia. My view is, for what it's worth, that it's a sort of a kind of a byplay of, the old Marxist ideology, the cultural Marxism. Like in the snapshot, I know you've been through this about 1 billion times since the mid part of the last decade, but just for the audience of based, what's the précis?
Well, so let's break it down. When you say Marxism, what are we talking about, right? Now, I'm sure most of your audience know, but Marxism, this idea that adopted particularly in the Soviet Union, was the idea that you have... The way to understand society is it's a battle, it's a power struggle between the oppressors and the oppressed. And this is one of the reasons I'm so surprised that people are surprised in what we've seen post-October 7th. Well, people are, why do young people hate Israel? Why do young people start saying all this stuff? Because it's that same dynamic, right? The powerful, the oppressed, and the way you know somebody's the oppressor is that they are successful, is that they have wealth, they have capital, they have influence. And so Jews obviously are going to be the oppressors no matter what's happening. So the Marxist dynamic, oppressor versus oppressed, and what the Marxists in the Soviet Union said is, we've got to upend this, we've got to replace it. The peasants and the workers who are being oppressed by the capitalist and the bourgeois, we've got to flip that, right? And we've got to put the worker and the peasant in charge, and the bourgeois and the capitalist, well, in the ground, or at the very bottom of society. So in the 60s, Western Marxists worked out that this wasn't going to work in the West, because it's like that thing about America. You can't tax... You're never going to get Americans to support taxing rich Americans, because every American thinks he's going to be rich one day. Yeah. And Western working class people didn't want a bloody revolution to overthrow the bourgeois. What they wanted was more rights and a better deal and more of the pie, etc. So then how do you divide society along those lines? Well, you try and weaponize things like race and sex, and so really, what I think wokeness is race Marxism. Yeah. It's that identitarian politics, a grievance-based politics, which, by the way, is now producing an equal and opposite reaction, I think, coming down the pipe on the right too, where people get into this grievance mentality. They start thinking with their skin color before anything else, and this was predictable. This is why people like me, who would have been on the left 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I'm somewhere kind of in the middle, floating now. But I've been saying, like, don't do this, because you're going to cause a reaction, and what you're doing is A, wrong, and B, will produce a reaction that you don't want to.
Yeah, it's a great précis and a fascinating subject. Conscious that you've got people to meet in this building and a lot of stuff to do. where's the tour going from here?
So I'm speaking in Parliament House today,
Yep.
and then I'm heading over to have a couple of days off this weekend with a friend, with an old friend, and then heading to Sydney, and then back to Perth. We're doing an event with Tony Abbott at Sydney University. I'm doing a speaking engagement in Sydney. You're pulling a face. Well, I look forward to that. Look, but listen, man, we got to engage with young people. We've got to engage with young people, and we've got to, the ideas that I talk about, I want young people to hear them, and I'm trying to make them sexy, because actually I think that at the end of the day, ideas like individual personal responsibility, you are in control of your destiny, you're not a victim. Young people do want to hear that. Young people don't want to be miserable and sad and depressed. They want an empowering message, and so we got to take it to them. And that sometimes means that they're going to cry and get upset and whatever, but that's okay. I mean, if we are adults, that's our job, is to go out there and persuade. Right? We got to believe that young people are persuadable. So I'm super excited about talking to people who don't agree with me.
That's great.
It's actually one of the frustrations that I have is, I keep being painted as right-wing because most of the people who invite me to speak with them are on the right. I'd love to talk to more left-wing people because I sort of think they would benefit from hearing what I'm saying. Do you know what I mean? So I'm super excited about that. And then back to Perth, speaking to some students there again. So I'm seeing a little bit of the country, and I've enjoyed it so much. I'd love to come back at some point.
You've got to come back. You've got to come to Adelaide. We're going to take you to the University of Adelaide, and we're going to save it with this very message. So it's great to have you here. Great to meet in person. And thanks. And we'll give you a little tour of the building.
I appreciate that. That'd be wonderful.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Konstantin.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you.
Great to see you, Alex. Thank you.